And as Jessica said, I'm still, it's probably still as many unknowns as knowns, to be honest. If I'm, when you take, there's a lot of information you've seen this morning about what's happening in the lab and taking it out to the paddock, and I've probably got a couple of contentious bits here, which hopefully will fire off a bit of questioning, but this is a case of what I'm seeing practically week to week. So we know a lot about the psyllid itself, the vector, which is actually the easy bit. If it wasn't for liberibacter, I think we'd be in the room today, to be honest. We know about growing day degrees. We are trying to use that practically with growers to say, hey, look, the next 10 days, it's not going to be hot, 17, 18 degrees at daytime, 10 at night. Let's do the maths, work out the grade. The life stage might take 40, 50 days. We don't need to be spraying on tight intervals on a 50-day life cycle. If it gets to January, February, temperatures change, life cycles tighten up. So we can use that practically. And that's the useful stuff where you can actually make a change on the ground. We know about the life stages. We've been through all that side of things. The sensory stuff is what really still, to me, is probably an unknown. We've done a lot of stuff through CPLI work, Y-tube experiments, looking at putting various compounds against water, what's attracting them. I have a bit of a theory, which I'll touch on in a minute, but that's not scientifically proven. Another thing we're looking at and trying to get to the bottom of this year is the gut contents. What are these things feeding on outside of the potato growing season? We're lucky in Canterbury. We pretty much shut down for winter and get frost. There's no potatoes in the ground, but these things are still out there in the environment somewhere. What are they feeding on? Fair enough, they might. We've spent a lot of time this last year ripping boxthorn out. We've actually got huge boxthorn removal programs through Potatoes New Zealand, and that's been successful. But we still need to know what they're feeding on. I think it's probably fair to say they'll feed on anything with a phloem, but they just won't complete their life cycle on there. But we don't know it, so it's an unknown. So
anything with a phloem,
yeah,
they don't feed very likely because they probe to see if they like it, and if it's a grass, for example, they got it.
Yeah. So the vector itself, the liberibacter, is it in the environment or have we just got it in the potato stock? We don't actually know. I mean, I'm a bit like yourself, Jeff. I can't believe that in an island the size of Australia, there's no liberibacter in the background. Are we just cycling liberibacter around our potato crops at very low levels? There's another huge question about tighter levels. How much have we got? We might not see it. This last season, for instance, we saw a lot of innovator seed crops commercially growing that would get to this sort of height and then collapse with liberibacter. There's no psyllid flying at the time. There's obviously a very, very low level of bacteria in those seed that eventually multiplied up and took the plant out. So we've got tighter levels. We've got variety, like I say, different colours, different attractions, different response and vigour, I suppose, as well, in terms of how they can deal with liberibacter, but they all get it eventually. It builds up enough to cause the damage. And we know about the transition speed. We know it's quick to acquire. So, there's some knowns on those thresholds and monitoring. Man, that's probably where most of my hair went. It's, I look at it very simply and think, look, in terms of a threshold, the traps themselves, like I say, psyllid's not a pollen feeder. So it's purely luck. It hits that trap and we count it. But you try and multiply that up against what could be happening in that paddock. There could be hundreds. There are probably hundreds. And then I saw some stuff out of Washington saying the egg laying, there was some stuff they were potentially saying it could be up to 1,000 eggs. But whatever, 300, 500, it's massive. And if we sit there and go, there's only 3 on that trap, why would people? Well, if 3 adults lay 500 eggs or 1,000 eggs and we sit back and twiddle our thumbs and think, it's not a lot, it suddenly becomes major. So, and then monitoring, you might be planting anywhere between 30,000 and 100,000 tubes a hectare. So how many plants can you actually do? As a percentage, you can never check them all. So you end up learning where you need to go and have a look. And that sort of leads on to some of what we were saying a minute ago about certain plants showing it. We know a lot about beneficials. And once again, hats off to these guys, IPM Technologies, Plant Food Link, we've identified a lot of what's doing the work for us, working under the leaves where all the trouble is. And that's led on to, well, we'll touch on it as we go through. Obviously, the chemical control, once again, another massive project that we did with CPLI and Plant and Food, looking at what we've currently got. Is it working? Yes, it is. What does it do on beneficial? Paul, IPM Technologies, got a really good web page in terms of, I mean, there is no soft chemical. There's no such thing as a purely soft chemical. There's just more and less soft. So once you know your beneficials, what's out there, what do you choose to actually manage that crop? Well, first thing I put up is, you know, when I sit there, you've got to get it in perspective, to be honest with you. I mean, I look at it and just think, well, it is what it is. Potato growing is an expensive operation, and there'll be a number of different people in the room will say, no, it's this, this is the whatever the figure is, it's bloody big. It's 20, 25k a hectare or something in that region, if you're going to be honest. There's a lot of money being spent. A TPP program might be $500. It might be nothing. It might be $1,500 if it's Burbank and it's out there for 160 days. It looks like a large amount of money. You're right. But what I've put in red is everything. The yield is still absolutely king. You know, you don't go into the season thinking, right, I've just got to nail this psyllid program. You just think, well, the psyllid program is going to be what it's going to be. We've got to grow tonnage. That's actually all that matters. The quality is obviously key, but the yield is king. Because I mean, at the end of the day, if you take that $1,500 cost, if you grow 50 tonne a hectare, it's a bit eye-watering at $30. You start climbing up the yield curve, it suddenly becomes a little bit more palatable. And our job is to make sure we're concentrating on yield, getting the tonnage up, growing more potatoes off less area is the trick. And then when I look at zebra chip as a cost, so if we get 1% zebra chip on a 75 tonne a hectare crop, that's 3/4 of a tonne a hectare at, you throw the number in. If it was $500, $300 or $400 a hectare for every 1%. So it's all a case of just understanding the numbers. Like I say, not the same in table because the criteria are different, but I would suggest that we need to manage that. We don't want to be sending people grey spuds that they break their teeth on when they buy them. It's not really great for the table industry going forward. So like I said, the challenge is liberibacter. I would suggest there's absolutely zero way of stopping an adult landing and feeding. There's no product out there. There's no magic. And I liken it to non-persistent virus transmission. You can't stop that bit. And, you know, I spent a bit of time up with Charlie Rush up in the States way back pre-COVID, and their message was the same. They were fighting psyllid years ago, and they said it's all about managing what's happening in the field. That's the key part for them. You can't stop that initial landing and feeding. As you say, it's so quick, so random. So here's a bit of a contentious one. Do they land on sick plants? Sick plants are under stress. The first part of the stress mechanism is the release of ethylene in the plant. The stress chemical, it's a gas. I have a thought process that it's a little bit like a powdery scab zoospore swinging or swimming along a diffusion gradient. Are they actually honing in on ethylene? Because I walk paddocks, I'm sure you all have, and the random nature of where they come in makes me wonder, is it rhizo that's causing stress? Is it powdery causing stress? Whatever it is it dry? Is it wet? Is it a stress mechanism? So I can't prove that. That's just me, wet finger in the air, really, to be honest with you. But if that was the case, an ethylene plant, the first thing ethylene does, it drops calcium off cell walls. It denudes the calcium off the cell walls. Cell walls are easier to feed on. Very easy for that to acquire the bacteria, sorry. And, but, if you are that female that's feeding on that plant, would you then lay your eggs on a plant that's going to die? More unknowns. Do they then move onto a healthier plant? And it's back to what you said before about if they've ingested the bacteria, do they then focus on a healthy plant? You would have to think that they would think, right, I want a healthy plant for my offspring. And is that the start of that whole, that's the plant that's got 500 eggs, whatever it might be, and that's the sort of centre point. So like I say, the only way to get control, in my opinion, is preventing those infield populations. And really the rest about what I'm going to speak about is how I suppose we've approached growing the crop. This is not just about insecticides at all. That's one of the last slides. This is about if I carry my theory forward, we'll see how that goes. I mean, one of the first things that's already been mentioned is volunteer control. You know, we can wax lyrical all day long about how good we are at controlling psyllid in paddocks, but if that's next door to you, you've got a pretty constant source next door. Some pretty good technology out there now. There's a lot of, you know, laser or camera weeders coming on. Some pretty smart tech coming along. What can we do in the paddock? Hydroglide, get your webs right, grow your crop right, and leave as little behind as you can. You know, that's not new, but it's, you know, there is still old technology available in terms of managing that, but it's a major. You know, we have a number of growers who are quite happy to supply a landowner with 2 shots of Starane for the wheat, because at least they can try and do something to the volunteers that they've leaving behind. And there's some pretty aggressive chemistry out there. Aminopyrilid, you know, if you can use aminopyrilid somewhere in your system, that'll smash potatoes all day long. But you've got to be pretty brave and understand what's coming in the years ahead. So there are some options out there, but, you know, another thing is, how far are these things traveling? You know, you look at some of those maps of the states and you think, well, it must be drifting up there, but how far is it? Each stage is moving a smaller bit. Probably more unknowns again. This goes on to crop stress. You know, as far as I'm concerned, this is the good, the bad, and the ugly in 2 photos, to be honest with you. On the left-hand side, you've got someone ploughing on top. Dusty conditions, dry, no compaction. On the right-hand side, rotary cultivations, wet soil, wheels in the middle of beds. You might think, where's the relevance here with psyllid? This means that when you dig down behind that wheel, it's going to be like concrete under there at probably 20 centimetres. If your irrigation planning's not up to it, you're going to find a plant there that's already going to be struggling for moisture at some point in all likelihood. And another unknown is that one of the mechanisms, because that ethylene mechanism, doesn't matter what the stress is, whether it's UV, whether it's dry, whether it's liberibacter. I mean, liberibacter is an oxidative stress. And all of those stresses will kick off ethylene to a varying degree. So this is, like I say, this is the practical side of what can we do. And you would likely see the benefits on a whole load of diseases, whether it's Alternaria, whether it's psyllid. It's that, back to what you said, Francis and Jessica, stressed plants. Not going to touch on this too much. Nature strips, already seen that, the benefits that they can have. And that's an ongoing plan. You know, should we be looking at that instead of planting certain headlands? That's for individual businesses to answer, but it's certainly a reservoir by which we can hold beneficials there. Another thing I'm quite pedantic about, to the case of being probably quite boring, to be honest with you, but on the left-hand side, you'll notice that anyone who's looked at potato crops, if you've got that's where your sort of end of the rows are, you'll see destoners pulling up, and this is Canterbury again, of course. Destoners pulling up early, planters going over the top and planting them shallower and shallower until they're out on the roadway. And of course, those row end plants just get absolutely smashed with psyllid. Back to stress again. So I'm adamant that we need to be able to pull right the way through. Go too far with your destoner or your tiller, keep the fertilizer on, switch your planter off at full depth and then lift it out. You see the rows are just being pulled through there, but that to me is what a crop should look like. You know, that's a healthy crop. It's humming. And the other thing you'll notice, and this is once again a management thing, is the lack of tram lines. You know, tram lines, crop damage, root damage. Is that you know, we can't hide away from lateral wheelings, but it's just a case of minimising damage all the time, minimising stress. For me, that was a yield map. You know, it's a case of looking at what your potential is as far as I'm concerned. Like I said before, grow as much as you can off as little area. But if you can measure everything, it makes it a hell of a lot easier. If you can suddenly realise your end headlands are just costing you money, they're slow, you get a lot of compaction, you have to keep going back and planting them, then you're a pain in the arse when it comes to digging. They're probably the areas where you've had a lot of traffic, difficult to get the compaction back out. But they're the areas where you get the psyllid coming in. Is that why we get edge effects or unknowns? But my gut feeling is that if you can concentrate and grow a stress-free crop, hit those yield numbers, makes it an awful lot easier if you've got those measured numbers to actually prove what's making you money in the paddock. There's some pretty good tech out there as well. I mean, I'm always had a good conversation with Daniel this morning about there's so much tech. Half the time you're spending trying to figure out what's worth spending on and not. We use AgWorld as a program for our crop recording side of things, and they've basically got NDVI as a free over the top. So when we talk about scouting, you know, for me, you're better off to take an NDVI image if you've got one. So this was a paddock we had this year up near Darfield, and that's actually post the crop now. But, you know, you've got that technology which can just maybe give you a few things that your eyes might not be able to see. You know, if you go into a paddock and see an area that is a different colour, that might be the place to go and scout. And like I said before, if you've got those row ends, if you've got those areas where they're stressed, you can go in there and find the problem. I can't give you an answer in terms of what those numbers should be. For me, it's a bit like dropping a flag. Once you find it, you're into it, and then it's a case of managing it from there on, in the absence of knowing anything more at this point in time. But it's some good tech out there. But what I've put up on the top left there is really the bottom bit should be the first bit. Is just plan everything. How much water have you got? How quickly can you get round? I mean, at the end of the day, we would work on the fact that you probably need 6, 7, 8 mils a day of water available, because when that northwest's blowing, and it's not every day, but it's, you transmit that into a tonne a hectare a day of bulking. So can you afford to lose a tonne a hectare a day of bulking because you can't irrigate enough? But on the flip side of that, is it actually costing you in terms of crop stress? So if you've got a paddock with horrible little short work at the side there, and you're on a rain gun, it's going to take you 2 days to get that little area done. And are you actually going to irrigate that little end headland? You should, but do you actually do it? And then do we do it well? Should we just look at that water resource and say, well, hold on a minute, we've got a nice square bit of the paddock, it's 4 runs, let's do it properly, forget that bit, let's put flowers out there, because that only yields us 25 tonne a hectare anyway. But have we actually done the measurements in the first place to know that? So planning irrigation, planning nutrition. You know, if we're throwing too much nitrogen out, you build yourself a canopy that you can't spray through. Certainly with things like moonlight, you know, you can grow things taller than I am, and are you actually benefiting? So plan planting to mitigate stress. Seed size, timing and quality. You know, if you're going to, certainly for us, you would be brave probably to put a 2840 in the ground in August, 2840 mil seed, because it's got no resource behind it, and it's going to sit under the ground for 6 weeks, getting attacked by every pathogen in the soil, and it's going to creep up through the ground, have no zip behind it. So it's a plant on the back foot, pretty much. If it's also a seed with some disease on it, you know, just management. It's really just a case of looking. And like I say, I'm not Pukekohe based, so I'm just saying it as I see it from where I sit. But look at all those resources. Cut seed. You know, we don't want to be putting cut seed in August, September. That's just madness. It's just a weakened plant from the go, really. Variety and growing days. You know, I would be incredibly brave if I was growing unirrigated moonlight in Darfield. I'd probably be out of a job, to be fair, because that's just putting yourself in a position where you can have a problem. You know, it's a case of understanding how your varieties are going to be. Darfield for us is one of those really weird areas. I don't know if you probably know the area well, but Southbridge on the coast, a lot of boxthorn down there that's now been removed. Darfield up the Waimak River, and it just seems to sit as an outlier. It always seems to have high temperatures. It's warmer up there, isn't it, to be fair, Jessica? The temperature, well, you live at Kirwee and the sun shines, so you would know, but, you know, it's a slightly warmer area, but we have these geographical quirks that you need to be aware of. I mean, irrigation frequency is a huge one, and availability. Like I said, if you actually get, you know, but we've got a lot of guys with some good capacitance probes now, and it certainly opens your eyes in terms of how much water you need every day. And I would rather have less water, or, you know, the amount of water on less area than a sprinkling across everything and trying to do half a job. And then, like I said, I've already spoken about the nutrition, the canopy architecture side of things that we'll touch on. Hot and cold testing, different views on that. Interesting numbers. Like I said, probably max out in terms of what percentage of the population has liberibacter. I guess my concern is the fact that if liberibacter is actually only being held within the potato genome in our area, if all the psyllid that are being caught are cold, but then they move in and feed on a hot plant, we've acquired it. So difficult one. And like I say, I know you probably manage psyllid differently up here and use that data. So I'm led to believe, I don't know, but I would be dubious because we've had some very, very low trap counts this year. Probably the last 2 years have been low, but we've got higher zebra chip this year than last year. Still not bad, but I don't feel personally that we've got enough confidence yet to be able to use that data to change too much. Chemistry and the application, it's a big area, eh? It's so like I say, trap results and scouting. We can probably talk all day about that and everybody's thoughts about it. To be honest with you, I look at the traps personally as a more of, like we said this morning, Daniel, more of a trend, what's happening. But I do tend to use that as a bit of a drop flag. Here we go. We're into it. Scouting, similarly, you know where you can potentially scout to find the problem. But 40 random plants out of a 20 hectare paddock at 50,000 a hectare is probably not a great percentage. So it's a case of knowing that. Plenty of work now, like I said, about beneficials. So what these products do in terms of beneficial damage. And that's all graded as well. I think that website that Paul Horn's got is well worth a look. Because, like I said, nothing's purely soft. So it's a case of really understanding that. And obviously Jessica's work, that was unbelievable in terms of the claims that were made by the products, the effects that we saw on the life stages, but then the actual knock-on effect through the life stages of various chemistry. Even if it didn't have time to work on the life stage, it was claimed to have an effect on that, followed through in terms of different stages, egg laying, mortality later on. So that was really good. I've already said upcoming whether we can use that to a degree in terms of managing intervals. So that's certainly an option. Crop stage, you've got this whole complexity about if you've got a mature crop this high and you want to use purely a contact insecticide, good luck. I go back to Jessica's work. You've got to remember that Jessica's work in the lab, every single product was sprayed until virtually runoff. The perfect scenario in terms of coverage. And I don't think much hit 100% mortality. So in the best case, it's still not going to be everything. So, and I was going to make a comment about the oils. Oils are brilliant if you can hit everything, cover everything. But in reality, questionable. I mean, there is the the non-chemical oils, silicon, garlic, fish oils, these well, I wouldn't say unproven. I mean, oils are proven, but all of these things have challenges with them. If the ethylene thing stands up, can we mask that to a certain degree with some of these more, odor producing products? I don't know. That's another unknown. Going to go away with more questions than answers today. But yeah, it's all about matching the product. So we've got some very, very good systemic stuff, things like the Moventos that can move up and down and bypass a certain amount of that canopy architecture side of things. So it's really a case of understanding that, the beneficials you've got, the plant you've got, how fast the plant growing. In those early stages, it's probably fair to say you can get a new compound leaf every 1 to 2 days. So you've got some reps. So if you're using purely contact right early on in the season, 2 days' time, you'll have a whole load of leaves that are not protected. So it's just a case of understanding that. But you might be forced down that route if pressure's low. And if you have got to use 16 sprays, you've only got so many. So you've got to manage what you've got. One thing that is worth pointing out was something like Perimicarb that came out of that data was really quite useful, because that's probably the one product that sits along as a really useful way of getting some vapor action inside the canopy. Most of the problems under the leaf, as we know, it's nymphs and egg, or certainly nymphs under there. Very difficult to hit them. Yes, Movento is brilliant, but something like Perimicarb, incredibly good on a number of beneficials, but it goes through that vapor stage as well as translaminar. So actually quite a useful spike. to some of those other products in terms of getting some control inside. Delivery system and water volume we'll probably touch on again in a minute. I mean, like I say, you can see on there, spent a lot of time both within the CPLI and sort of outside looking at how can we get these products to where they need to be, because that's actually the challenge. Obviously a potato canopy is horizontally interlocking, so having some sort of horizontal trajectory on your spray droplets is critical. And at this point in time, if you're down to boom spraying, some of these angled jets are probably giving us pretty reliable results. Probably see less and less out and out air systems as we used to, the old sleeve on the back. That's probably, I don't see many of those down where we are now, to be honest with you. And once again, we can argue all day long about different types of nozzles, and then obviously there's things like obviously harvest interval on label, and I've also put down here if you're lifting and shifting, those last sprays, if you're going to be lifting a green crop in 30-40 days time and you find some psyllid, well, if it gets infected today and it's going to be actually on somebody's plate in probably 40 days time, at what point do you say we don't actually need to worry anymore? So it's a case of understanding where your crop's going to be. If it's going into storage, very different beast, obviously. I took these two. These are just some snapshots. Pretty exciting slide at this time of day, isn't it? But left-hand side is Movento, right-hand side is Avid. Two completely different products. One highly systemic, one not. But the same message that you'll see in there in the bump. Sufficient water to ensure good coverage of all foliage. And similar over here. Same thing again. You have to have good coverage. So abamectin, I would totally agree with that. In theory, Movento not, but they're always saying, and like we said, Jessica, you did it in the lab to full coverage. And so here's the challenge. It's this application technology of these products is really the thing. Resistance management, I think it's probably fair to say, Daniel, new products coming in is going to get less and less. I don't see a huge pipeline coming to get us, and we shouldn't, necessarily be relying on that. We've got a lot of different groups of chemistry out there that we can use, but you do fall to this, the process of looking at your crop, how fast it's growing, what have we got, how many psyllid, what life stages, what beneficials, what product systemic contact. So you've got this variable thing going on in terms of what you're trying to do. Resistance strategy would suggest that we should be blocking products up in theory. So looking at blocks of 2 or 3 of the same thing, I'm a little bit 50-50 on that. And I look at something like Movento especially, which is just so critical purely because of the fact of the way it moves, in that I try, I might block 2, I might not, depends what I'm seeing. That's an interesting one. Yeah. And I'm not saying I'm going to give you a yes or a no answer here, and I'm sure there might be a few daggers thrown from the floor. I'll see what happens. Spray volume in terms of millilitres per plant. If you're spraying 40,000 plants a hectare with 200 litres of water, you've basically got a teaspoonful of water per plant for a spray solution. So you've got to get that over every underside, every stem, top to bottom. Good luck. Even with double the water, this is the challenge. That's the problem with oil. With all these contact products, with Avid, whatever it might be, they're great. They're really very potent at what they do, but can you actually get them where they need to be? Is the challenge. So like I say, we've touched on the air resistance, the angle jets, the aerial application, spreaders and droplet size. So I guess everybody's just got to look at their own system, and you might be getting great results. So it might not be a problem for you. Great. I think we're still working on it. Aerial's a big thing for us, and it becomes a different beast when you look at that. I threw this in there as a bit of a left field one. So this grower, we sort of said, well, we don't want tram lines. We don't want to go down that road. We want to go aerial. We'll use something as accurate as we think we can, which is a drone. This was the second year of using the drone, 50 litres a hectare. We use a reasonable rate of duet in there to try and get as much spreading as we possibly can, but you can't actually see the result until you put Reglone on. In this situation, it was actually dry when we applied the regler, and hence I had to use the litre just for safety. But it's, you know, for me, it's not a bad result. But you can see there's a lot of green in there. If Reglone had hit everything, it would all be brown. So if you're just going through the season trying to get contact chemistry onto those plants, you can tell there's going to be a lot of plant that's not covered. Interestingly, that's probably 2/3 of its way of going through the factory now, and it's about 0.9% zebra chips so far. So it hasn't been a high pressure season. That was Darfield, as I said. So it's that's about as high a pressure as it gets. But yeah, so some of that drone technology, aerial technology, it's different, as you'll know. I mean, you guys can't have a air tractor roaring around at 150 knots flying over everybody's gardens. You know, we're a bit lucky like that in Canterbury, whether that's lucky or not. But certainly the chopper and the drone appear to be giving us some pretty good coverage inside the canopy. So that's really where we're at there. And I was asked by Murph just finally to mention nets. And like I say, if you had a hectare of spuds, you just put a net over them because it's good. It's a good barrier. You know, it's a bit of trickle irrigation. I liken it to trickle. You know, it's great technology, but you've got to have some pretty good people to put it all down, get it all up, run it. Sorry, Jessica. I
just wanted to say that because the mesh that we use, that
yes,
Francis was talking about, they had a larger mesh size.
Yeah.
So we reported that back to Murph. So this has a smaller mesh size.
Yeah, this is the psyllid net. Yeah. Which is dear. You know, it's expensive stuff. It's more a case of the practicalities around laying it. But that said, look, I'd notice, you know, Swedes over in the UK now are all grown under nets, practically big field areas. So it's doable, but I'm not seeing anybody. Look, pivots, laterals, driving. No, great. Unfortunately, a great theory, and it might work in certain areas. If you've got turbo rains and big roadways, it might be an option. From what
how often do you have to adjust it?
Adjust what? Sorry.
The netting. How often do you have to raise it?
Good question. Never actually seen it. I've got a couple of seed growers who are using it on some very high gen, you know, very early field populations, but literally that's quarter of a hectare at most.
I think they put it down.
Pre-emergent.
Remove it until.
Yeah, that's right. Pre-emergent. Yeah.
And a big organic grower in the North Island has been using it
Yeah.
as well. He leaves the sites open, so there's actually he's been pretty good with it, and I know so that natural enemies can actually come in as well.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of putting it over and leaving it there.
Yeah.
The downside is that aphids can lay their young through the.
Yeah. But look, it's just another angle, but I wouldn't say anybody's adopted it, but that's probably down to our irrigation systems with laterals and pivots and stuff.
We have actually driven pivots over the top of them.
Yeah, the problem is that's got to last 10, you know, it's over $1,000 a hectare a year. I think it's 10,000 a hectare. Right. That was pre-COVID, so it's probably doubled. So the costs are eye-watering, and, you know, 10 years of lateral wheelings, I would have thought it would be torn to shreds by then. So it might have a place, but I don't know whether I've actually answered anything, but I would suggest, as I said to Daniel again this morning, the problem is that every season is so different. You know, the last 2 years haven't probably been what we would call classic psyllid seasons. We've had periods when it looked like it was going to get out of control, and then you get 150 mils of rain and the temperature. It's a nice problem that we haven't got psyllid, but I'd be brave to say we've beaten it. Other parts of the world, like I say, I was quite surprised up in Washington was the fact that they didn't have any concerns about psyllid probably 5 years ago. But then when you actually go up and see what they're doing, they're putting Vidate through the pivot every 10 days. And outside of the circle, there's just nothing there. There's nothing. It's just desert. So there's nothing for them to live on. So you know, when you see the skull and crossbones in every paddock, you think, okay, that's one approach, but I wouldn't suggest that's where we want to be going. But I think we've made some progress. You know, I think certainly the by identifying some of this stuff and understanding those insecticides better and the application and beneficials and what they're actually doing for us is certainly moving us in the right directions.
We're running a little bit over time here, but is anyone got any quick questions for Roger or any online? No. Oh, thank you, Roger. The next speaker is Lex, who's going to talk about the experience in the tomato industry, which is TPP and liberibacter. Thank you.